Hello guys, welcome to my channel. So today we are going to talk about Spring Boot interview questions, and here in this video we are going to talk about the most frequent or commonly asked questions on Spring Boot. Now before we actually move on to the video, if you are new to my channel, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel yet, please do, and let's kickstart this video. So the first question is, what is a Spring Boot? So Spring Boot is a framework that simplifies the setup and development of Spring applications by providing defaults for code and configuration and integrating commonly used components. So in layman terms, we still have Spring Framework, but with Spring Framework we had to do a lot of boilerplate code setup, which we actually don't want to do, but we had to do. But with Spring Boot, it made the developers' life simple by actually bootstrapping all of the things that we used to do as a setup with Spring Framework. So it helps a lot. It actually provides a lot of functionality, but in layman terms, Spring Boot came over Spring, which simplifies the setup and development of Spring applications. Now, what are the main features of Spring Boot? So we have auto configuration, we have standalone applications, we have embedded servers, we have production ready features, then microservices support, and last, simplified configuration with properties file. So just to summarize in one liner, so with auto configuration you don't have to provide where your configuration lies to the application. It will automatically pick it up. With standalone applications, it means that when you run your application as a Java application, it will run your web application. So that is your standalone application. Embedded server is that you don't have to actually embed Tomcat or any other server afterwards when you are setting up your project. It comes by default to you through Spring Boot. Now production ready features, we have Spring Actuator, through which you can do a lot of things which you want your application to behave before you actually move your application to production. With microservices support, you already know that we got controller, REST controller, and we can do a lot of things which only microservices framework support. With simplified configuration, it means that we have an application.properties file through which you can put every piece of configuration in that file itself, and you don't need to create it. It comes to you by default. You just need to provide your configuration. Now next question, what is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot? So like I said before, Spring is an existing framework designed for building enterprise applications, but Spring Boot is a project that simplifies the setup and development of Spring applications. So it is on top of Spring. So it provides defaults and pre-configured setup. So you don't need to do a lot of boilerplate things. Now explain the role of Spring Boot application annotation. So this annotation is a very big and vast annotation, and this is a very common question. So Spring Boot application annotation is a convenience annotation that combines configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. So this is a major annotation through which you actually get auto configuration and additional functionalities, right? So when I said before that the main features of Spring Boot comes with auto configuration, so that is how it get you that. Now it marks the main class of a Spring Boot application with this annotation, and it enables auto configuration and component scanning. So you don't need to provide where your component lies. It will automatically scan your components. How do you externalize configuration in Spring Boot? So what does this mean, externalize? So it means that when you want to provide your configuration outside of your development components. So configuration can be externalized using properties file, which is your application.properties or application.yaml. So it also has environment variables or command line arguments. Spring Boot also supports configuration through value annotation and configuration properties annotations bean, right? So this is how you actually externalize. How do you use profiles in a Spring Boot? So why do we use Spring profiles? So Spring profiles allow you to define different configuration for different environment. So let's say you have 3 environment, you have development, you have QA, you have prod, right? So for these 3 you need 3 set of different configuration, as in maybe your database is different, maybe your server is different, things like that you can put up in 3 different profiles. What does this mean is your application should automatically pick up the relevant profile depending on where you are running the application, whether it is your dev environment, whether it is your production environment. So here you can specify profiles using the spring.profiles.active property in application.properties or YAML, or you can use profile annotation. How does Spring Boot manage dependency injection? So Spring actually came with this major IOC concept, and with which we have dependency injection. So IOC is a concept, dependency injection is a way through which you implement IOC. IOC is inversion of control. So Spring Boot uses Spring dependency injection mechanism where beans are defined and managed by the Spring container. We can use annotations like auto-wired, inject, or constructor injection to inject dependencies. So in layman terms, what is dependency injection? So dependency injection basically is a design pattern, and like I told you, it came with Spring. This is to achieve inversion of control between classes and their dependencies. So dependency injection, or DI, allows you to inject the dependencies of a class rather than having the class create or locate them itself. So this promotes loose coupling and enhances testability and maintainability of the code. Alright, so there are few types of dependency injection. We have constructor injection, we have setter injection, and then we have field injection. So with constructor injection, you have a constructor, and on top of that you can use auto-wired annotation. With setter injection, you have your setter method, on top of which you will assign auto-wire annotation. Then for field injection, you have a variable or a field on which you will provide auto-wired annotation. Now how does this work? So beans are defined in Spring configuration, right? The configuration specifies how the beans are created and how their dependencies are injected. This is the first step. Then you have Spring container. So Spring container is responsible for creating and managing the lifecycle of beans. So Spring container reads the configuration, create beans, and inject dependencies according to what we have provided in the configuration. Now here comes the main part, auto wiring. So Spring can automatically resolve and inject collaborating beans using the auto wired annotation. We can also use qualifier annotation along with auto wired to specify which bean to inject if multiple candidates are available. So there is a possibility that you have multiple auto-wired annotation. There is a possibility that you have multiple choices, or Spring has multiple choices. In that case, you can signify a name using your qualifier annotation. So what are the benefits that we are getting with dependency injection? We are getting loose coupling, we are getting easier testing, we are getting maintainability. Alright. Now next question, how do you configure data sources in Spring Boot? So when I say data sources, I mean your database configuration. So database configuration comes under your data source. Previously, before Spring Boot, we used to have a data source object on which we used to define every piece of configuration that is a must for connecting your database. Now we can use application.properties or application.yaml file to define those configuration. So here if you see, we have only 3 properties. One is your data source URL, as in where your database exists, then your username and password. So these 3 configuration Spring will use to create a data source object for us internally, and then it will connect the database for us. We don't have to do anything here. This is going to be done on itself. Alright. What is Spring Data JPA and how does it integrate with Spring Boot? So Spring Data JPA is part of the Spring Data project that provides an abstraction layer over JPA for data access. Spring Boot auto configures Spring Data JPA repositories if the Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency is included. So whenever you want to use templates with which you can do a lot of functionality over a database. In that case, you want to use JPA. JPA provides you a lot of repositories which you can use, but how do we actually use it? That comes under Spring Boot auto configuration. So when we use Spring Boot starter data JPA dependencies, Spring Boot understands that what we want to do and it does it for ourselves. How do you create a RESTful web service in Spring Boot? So for REST specific, we have a controller annotation, which is your REST controller annotation, and you can also use controller annotation, but with that you have to use other annotation as well to provide or make it a REST controller. But just to signify on the code that you are working on a RESTful service, in that case you should use REST controller because the name suggests that you are working on a REST service. Now you can use HTTP request as well along with it, like get mapping, post mapping, or you can use request mapping along with the method type. What is Spring Boot Actuator? So like I told you before, this is a major feature with Spring Boot, and Spring Boot Actuator actually provides production ready features to help you monitor and manage your application. So it includes a set of built-in endpoints and tools that give insights into the application's internal state and metrics. So this makes it easier to manage and maintain application in production. So you can also have custom endpoints along with what you have been provided. You can also have added security. You can also have health checks, and you can do a lot of things when you are working on a production ready application. Now how do you secure a Spring Boot application? So you can secure a Spring Boot application using Spring Security. So Spring Security is a powerful and customizable framework that provides comprehensive security services for Java application. It involves configuring security settings using Enable Web Security and extending Web Security Configuration Adapter, or we can use OAuth2 and JWT for advanced security scenarios. So what we can do here is we can secure endpoints like your HTTP methods and actuator endpoints. We can use HTTPS, which will ensure that your application uses HTTPS to encrypt data transmitted between the client and server. We can also handle authentication and authorization. So authentication basically tells you that you have to verify user identities. Authorization means that grant or deny access based on user roles and permissions. Here we can also get protection against common vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting or maybe cross-site request forgery. We can also get protection against SQL injection. Now we can also use security headers to enhance your application security. We can also monitor and log security events. Also we get security testing. So here we can regularly test our application for security vulnerabilities. So this is how you secure a Spring Boot application using Spring Security. Now how do you test a Spring Boot application? So this is a very crucial aspect of ensuring that the application is reliable and functionable. So we want to test our application, so we have several options, like we can use unit testing, we can use integration testing, along with that controller testing, end-to-end testing, performance testing, right? Also we have security testing, so a lot of ways. So how do we do that? So for unit testing you can use JUnit, or you can use Mockito or Spring's mock-bean annotation to mock dependencies in unit test. You can use Spring Boot test annotation for integration testing. You can use data JPA test annotation for repository testing. Along with that you have controller testing. So for controller testing we have to use web MVC test annotation. So this annotation loads only the web layer controllers and allows you to test controllers with mock services. We have end-to-end testing, so for that we can use test rest template, or we can use web test client annotation. So for performance testing you have to use JMeter or maybe Gatling. For security testing, I have already told you before, you can use Spring Security Test, and this is how you actually test your Spring Boot application. Now how do you implement microservices with Spring Boot? So first thing first, we have to understand microservices architecture. right? So microservices architecture involves breaking down an application into small independent services that communicate over a network. Each service focuses on a specific business capability and is developed, deployed and scaled independently. Now here we can use REST or messaging based protocols in our Spring Boot application for the communication of microservices. Also we can use tools like Spring Cloud, which will help us with service discovery, configuration management. Now we have to create a separate individual Spring Boot application for a separate microservice, because each microservice is a standalone Spring Boot application. So defining microservice responsibility is a major thing. So if let's say you have an e-commerce website, in that case you will have a user service, you will have an order service, you will have a product service, right? So here we have to assign a responsibility for each microservice. Then you have to implement inter-service communication, for which we have already talked about. We can use RESTful APIs or we can use message brokers. So RESTful APIs is basically simple thing which we have already talked before, like you can use REST controller, you can use get mapping, post mapping annotations to create a RESTful API. Then you have message brokers like RabbitMQ, Apache Kafka for asynchronous communication and event driven architecture. So you can also use that. Now for service discovery, we have dependencies like Eureka server dependency and we have Eureka client. So services need to discover each other dynamically, so for which we want to use service discovery. Now for configuring Eureka server, we have an annotation enable Eureka server, which we have to use. Then we have to enable Eureka client for by using enable Eureka client annotation. Then we have to define some properties in application.properties or YAML. Additionally, you can also use API gateway. So API gateway acts as a single entry point for clients to interact with microservices. Spring Cloud Gateway is a very popular choice here, so you can use that. Now centralizing configuration, so we can use Spring Cloud Config to manage configuration centrally across microservices. Now there are a lot of things that can go wrong in a microservice architecture, so we should use distributed tracing like to track request across microservices. We can use Spring Cloud Sleuth and Zipkin. These are the very popular choices. Now for resilience and fault tolerance, we have to use Spring Cloud Circuit Breaker. So this is to handle faults and improve resilience. Now for security, use Spring Security always, and for testing we have already talked about. For deployment you can use Docker and Kubernetes. Now what is Spring Cloud and how does it integrate with Spring Boot? So Spring Cloud, like we just talked about, is a collection of tools and frameworks for building distributed systems and microservices architecture. So this provides solution for common problems when developing and managing microservice, such as service discovery, configuration management, distributed tracing and circuit breaking. So how to use it? First you have to use Spring Discovery, then you need to use Spring Cloud Config management, and then you have to use API gateway, then distributed tracing, then circuit breaker, then load balancing, and lastly security. So you have to use a few dependency to integrate Spring Cloud with Spring Boot, like Spring Cloud Starter Eureka Server dependency, Spring Cloud Starter Config dependency, and Spring Cloud Starter Gateway dependency. Then you need to annotate your configuration classes, like for Eureka Server, enable Eureka Server annotation. For Eureka Client, enable Eureka Client annotation. For Config Server, Eureka Config Server annotation. Then for Gateway, you don't need to do much. Then you need to configure properties in your application.properties or YAML. So that's that, and then you just need to deploy. Now how do we handle configuration properties with annotation configuration properties? So handling configuration properties is a powerful way to manage and validate external configuration in a structured manner. So how do we do that? So first thing first, we can create a Java class that will hold your configuration properties. So we can use configuration properties annotation, and then you can configure properties in application.properties or maybe YAML. So we first need to specify the properties there, Then we need to enable configuration properties support. So for that we have to use configuration properties annotation, and this is going to be in our main class. So if we are using Spring Boot application annotation, which we obviously are going to use, so this includes enable configuration properties, so we don't need to add any extra annotation. Spring Boot automatically scans for classes annotated with configuration properties annotations and bind the properties. Now to explicitly use, we can also use that, so that is additional thing. Now you can use configuration properties as well, so we can use we can inject the property class into other Spring managed beans using auto-wired or constructor injection. Now to validate configuration properties, we have to use jakarta.validation package. So we have validated annotation, then we can get similar annotation like not empty, maybe minimum, maximum, not null, something like that. So through that you can validate the configuration. Now to use this one, you have to use Spring Boot starter validation dependency. Now to summarize, how do you use it? First, define a Java class to hold configuration properties, then map properties from external configuration files. Third, validate properties. Fourth, easily inject and use these properties in your application. So next question, what are Spring Boot's embedded servers and how do you configure them? So Spring Boot embedded servers are a key feature that simplifies the deployment and management of Spring application. Instead of deploying your application to an external server, Spring Boot includes an embedded server in the application itself. This allows you to run your application as a standalone executable jar or WAR file, which is very useful for microservices and cloud native application. Now what do we get? We get Apache Tomcat by default, then we can use Jetty or Undertow. Now configuration wise, Tomcat is by default, so we don't need to do anything. We can just signify maybe a different port. So by default port is 8080, but you can change it, right? So that is that. Now to customize it, what you can do is you can use a configuration class, and in that you can create a bean of Tomcat Servlet Web Server Factory, and then you can create a new object and try to customize it. Now to use Jetty, first thing is you need to exclude Tomcat in your dependency. So we get Tomcat through Spring Boot Starter Web. So with that you need to first exclude Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. Once you do that, then you need to add a new dependency of Spring Boot Starter Jetty. Now for Undertow as well, you need to do the same thing. Now how do you handle exceptions globally in a Spring Boot application? So we can use, so first thing, why do we need to handle it? So handling exception globally in a Spring Boot application ensures that errors are managed in a consistent and centralized manner. So this improves both the maintainability of your code and the user experience. Now to implement this, we can use controller advice annotation. So this features allows you to handle exceptions globally across all controllers in your Spring Boot application. It is used to define global exception handlers that apply to all controllers. Now you can also use REST controller advice. So let's say if you are working on a RESTful API, then you want to use REST controller advice instead of controller advice. So this is to automatically apply a response body to all methods, eliminating the need for response body on each method. Now we can also use response entity exception handler. So for a more structured approach, especially in REST APIs, we can extend response entity exception handler to provide detailed and customizable error responses. So this is the example of how you can use it. Now custom exception classes. So if anything doesn't work for you, then you can also create a custom exception class to represent different type of errors in your application. This approach helps in identifying specific problems and handling them accordingly. So this is it for this video. If you have any questions, do let me know on the comment section of this video. I will attach the PDF of this PPT in the GitHub repository, and the link would be in the description of this video. and I really hope that we will meet in some another video. Till then, stay happy, keep learning, and bye bye.